The camp at Fort Des Moines. The summer of 1945 hung heavy over Iowa. A peculiar stillness settling over the prisoner of war camp at Fort Des Moines as news of Germany's surrender rippled through the barbed wire fences. Inside Barracks 7, 23 German women sat in various states of uncertainty, their eyes hollow from months of captivity, their minds wrestling with a reality they had never imagined. Greta Muller pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the narrow window, watching American soldiers go about their routines with an efficiency that seemed almost leisurely compared to the rigid militarism she had known. She was 32, though the war had aged her beyond her years. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to typing Wehrmacht communiques in Berlin, now bore the calluses of camp labor, mending uniforms, peeling potatoes, scrubbing floors. "They say we might be here for months yet," whispered Ilse Hoffman from her bunk. At 19, she was the youngest among them, captured while serving as a signals operator near the Western Front. Her blonde braids, once perfectly regulation, now hung in loose, uneven plaits. "My mother won't even know if I'm alive." Greta turned from the window, offering what she hoped was a reassuring smile. "The Red Cross will notify them. They have procedures." But even as she spoke, doubt crept in her voice. Procedures meant little in the chaos following Germany's collapse. Letters from home had stopped arriving weeks ago, leaving them suspended in a strange limbo between war and whatever came after. The women represented a cross-section of the Reich's final, desperate mobilization. There was Margarethe, the 47-year-old nurse from Hamburg who had seen horrors no training could have prepared her for. Frida, the mechanic who could repair any vehicle but couldn't fix her own broken spirit. Charlotte, the former opera singer whose voice had once filled concert halls in Munich and now sang only in whispered lullabies to comfort the others during nightmares. Their capture had been almost anticlimactic. The American forces had rolled through their position so quickly that resistance seemed pointless. Greta remembered the moment of surrender. Hands raised, faces showing more relief than fear. They had been tired of running, tired of the lies, tired of everything. The American guards were professional, even courteous, which confused many of the prisoners initially. Where was the brutality they had been warned about? The propaganda had painted Americans as savage liberators who showed no mercy. Instead, they found stern but fair treatment, regular meals, and even access to basic medical care. It was disorienting. Colonel Sarah Mitchell commanded the women's section of the camp, a rarity in the U.S. Army. She was a tall woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to see through pretense. She had established clear rules. Work details would be assigned fairly, rations distributed equally, and violence, verbal or physical, would not be tolerated from guards or prisoners. In return, she expected cooperation and civility. The camp itself was a converted training facility, its barracks designed for temporary housing, but now serving as more permanent quarters. The Iowa landscape beyond the fences seemed almost alien to the German women, vast, flat, and peaceful. No bomb craters, no rubble. It was as if the war existed only as a distant rumor here, rather than the all-consuming reality they had known. Greta had been appointed informal leader of Barracks 7. Not through any election, but through natural gravitation. She was educated, spoke reasonable English, and possessed a calm demeanor that helped settle disputes. She mediated arguments over bunk assignments, organized work details, and served as liaison with the guards. Today, she had been summoned to Colonel Mitchell's office, an unusual occurrence that sparked speculation among the women. As she crossed the dusty compound, she noticed workers erecting something in the recreation building, a large white screen and what looked like projection equipment. Colonel Mitchell sat behind her desk, reviewing papers. She looked up as Greta entered and saluted, gesturing for her to sit. "At ease, Muller. I have a proposal." The colonel's German was functional but heavily accented. "We are implementing a new program, cultural education. You and the others will watch an American film tomorrow evening. Attendance is mandatory." Greta's expression must have betrayed her confusion because Colonel Mitchell continued, "You've been fed propaganda for years. It's time you saw something real about America." about who we actually are. This isn't punishment, it's perspective. Walking back to the barracks, Greta felt a strange mixture of anxiety and curiosity. A film. Most of the women hadn't seen a movie in years. What would the Americans show them? More propaganda, surely, just from the other side. But something in Colonel Mitchell's tone suggested this was different, that this mattered somehow. That evening, she gathered the women and explained. The reactions varied from suspicion to cautious excitement. They would find out tomorrow what the Americans wanted them to see. Preparations and prejudices. The morning brought an electric tension to Barrack 7. News of the film screening had spread throughout the camp, creating ripples of speculation and debate. Some prisoners saw it as another form of indoctrination, while others welcomed any break from the monotonous routine of camp life. Greta woke before dawn, as was her habit. Sleep remained elusive most nights, her mind cycling through memories of Berlin, the city she had left behind, the life she had abandoned to serve a cause that now lay in ashes. She wondered if her apartment still stood, or if it had joined the countless other buildings reduced to rubble by Allied bombs. "You're thinking too much again," Margaretti observed from the adjacent bunk. The older nurse had an uncanny ability to read people, a skill honed through decades of observing patients. "I can hear it from here." Greta managed a weak smile. "Aren't we all thinking too much? What else is there to do?" Margaretti sat up, her gray hair falling loose around her shoulders. Before the war, she must have been handsome, perhaps even beautiful. Now, lines of exhaustion and sorrow carved deep grooves around her eyes and mouth. "I've been thinking about this film. Why now? Why make it mandatory?" "Control," suggested Frida from across the barracks, not bothering to lower her voice. The mechanic had never learned subtlety. "They want to show us how powerful they are, how defeated we are." Charlotte disagreed. "Maybe they genuinely think it will help us. The Americans are strange that way. They seem to believe in redemption." She said the last word carefully, as if testing its weight. The day proceeded with unusual restlessness. Work details were completed with less focus than usual. Conversations kept circling back to the evening's event. Some women tried to remember the last films they had seen. Most recalled propaganda pieces, newsreels showing German victories that now rang hollow, or the heavily censored entertainment approved by Goebbels' ministry. Ilsa, the young signals operator, approached Greta during the lunch distribution. "Fräulein Muller, do you think they'll show us something horrible? About the camps?" Her voice dropped to barely a whisper on the last words. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Rumors had been circulating, terrible rumors about camps in the East, about systematic murder, about crimes so monstrous that the mind recoiled from them. The American guards sometimes spoke of these things, their faces hard with anger and disgust. But many prisoners, including Greta herself, struggled to reconcile these stories with their understanding of Germany, their Germany. "I don't know," Greta answered honestly. "But whatever they show us, we must face it with dignity." Colonel Mitchell appeared at the barracks shortly after lunch, accompanied by Lieutenant Mary O'Brien, a young officer who served as translator despite her limited German. The colonel's presence immediately commanded attention, conversations dying mid-sentence. "Ladies," Mitchell began, waiting for O'Brien's translation. "This evening's screening will begin at 7 o'clock. You will form orderly lines and proceed to the recreation building. The film you will see is not a newsreel or a documentary. It is an entertainment film, a story. I ask that you approach it with open minds." She paused, letting the translation catch up. "I know many of you harbor resentment. Some of you may feel this is indoctrination. But I ask you to consider, for years, you were told what to think, what to believe, what to feel. Tonight, I'm simply asking you to watch. Form your own opinions. That's what freedom means." After Mitchell left, debate erupted. Frida remained skeptical. Freedom? We're prisoners. How can they speak of freedom? But others, including Charlotte, seemed moved by the colonel's words. Perhaps that's precisely why she speaks of it, to show us the difference. As evening approached, the women prepared with an attention to detail that surprised even themselves. They washed as best they could with the limited facilities, combed their hair, straightened their worn prison uniforms. It felt absurd, dressing up for a film screening in a POW camp. Yet it also felt important, a reclamation of some small dignity. Greta found herself remembering Berlin's grand cinemas, the marble lobbies, the plush seats, the excitement of a new premiere. She had gone often before the war, usually alone, losing herself in stories that transported her away from the tedium of secretarial work. The last film she'd seen was a propaganda piece about heroic submarine warfare, presented just before her deployment. She'd left the theater feeling empty, manipulated. At 6:45, Lieutenant O'Brien returned to escort them. The women lined up with military precision. Some habits died hard, and marched across the compound. The summer evening was beautiful, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. It seemed wrong somehow that nature could be so lovely while the world remained shattered. The recreation building had been transformed. Rows of folding chairs faced the large screen. American guards stood at intervals along the walls, their expressions neutral but watchful. Women from other barracks were already seated, perhaps 60 prisoners in total. The air smelled of institutional cleaning supplies and nervous anticipation. As Barracks 7 filed in, Greta noticed the projection equipment at the back of the room, sophisticated, professional. Whatever they were about to see, the Americans were taking it seriously. Colonel Mitchell stood near the front, conferring quietly with the projectionist. The women took their seats, the metal chairs scraping against the concrete floor. Whispered conversations created a low murmur throughout the room. Greta found herself seated between Margarethi and young Ilsa, who gripped the edges of her chair with white-knuckled tension. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, raising her hand for silence. The film you're about to see is It's a Wonderful Life, directed by Frank Capra and released earlier this year. It tells the story of one man's life and how it touches others. I chose this film specifically because it represents something fundamental about American values. Not our military might or our industrial capacity, but our belief in the worth of every individual, in community, in hope. She nodded to the projectionist. The lights dimmed. The room fell into darkness. And then, the screen flickered to life. Opening frames. The first images appeared on the screen like ghosts materializing from darkness. A starfield, vast and peaceful, accompanied by voices praying. Greta felt her breath catch. Even in this simple opening, there was something different, something the German cinema had lost years ago beneath the weight of propaganda and control. The prayers were for a man named George Bailey, voices overlapping in desperate pleading. The camera descended through clouds, through snow, toward a small town that looked like something from a fairy tale. Bedford Falls, the sign read, and already Greta felt a pang of longing for a place that existed only on celluloid. Around her, the other prisoners sat transfixed. Even Frida, who had sworn to maintain skeptical detachment, leaned forward slightly in her chair. The mechanical excellence of the projection impressed the mechanic in her. The clear image, the smooth motion, the quality of the print itself. American technical superiority was evident even here. The story began to unfold, introducing young George Bailey and his dreams of adventure, his desire to see the world beyond his small town. Ilsa whispered, "He sounds like me before the war." Greta squeezed her hand gently. As the narrative progressed, showing George's gradual sacrifice of his dreams for family and community, something unexpected began to happen in the recreation building. The rigid posture of military prisoners started to soften. Women who had maintained careful emotional distance for months found their defenses eroding. When young George saved his brother Harry from drowning in the frozen pond, Margarethi drew in a sharp breath. She had seen too many children in her hospital wards who hadn't been saved. The simple heroism of a boy pulling his brother from icy water carried weight she hadn't anticipated. The American guards had expected many reactions, but not complete absorption. Yet that's what was happening. 60 German women, prisoners of war, were being drawn into the life of George Bailey with an intensity that transcended language, nationality, and circumstance. The subtitles helped those who couldn't follow the English, but emotion needed no translation. Charlotte found herself captivating by the character of Mary Hatch, George's eventual wife. There was something in Mary's determination, her quiet strength, that resonated. Charlotte had known women like this in Munich, women who held families together while the world crumbled around them. The poisoning scene in Mr. Gower's drugstore brought gasps. Children were involved, and the tension was unbearable. When George prevented the disaster, several women exhaled audibly. They had lived through a war where so many disasters went unprevented, where so many Mr. Gowers had delivered poison in various forms. Then came George's wedding day and the run on the bank. Here, Greta found herself unexpectedly moved. The sacrifice of honeymoon money to save the building and loan, the way George and Mary gave up their dreams to help their neighbors. This kind of communal solidarity felt both foreign and familiar. The Nazi ideology had preached Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, but this felt different. This was voluntary, born of love rather than coercion. "Look at their faces," Margaretti whispered, referring to the townspeople receiving help from George. "That's gratitude, not fear." The film continued its journey through George's life. Births, deaths, frustrations, small triumphs. The prisoners watched as George Bailey aged, his dreams deferred but never quite dying, his family growing, his impact on Bedford Falls deepening in ways he couldn't see. Frida found herself identifying with George's frustration, his feeling of being trapped. She, too, had wanted to escape the confines of her small Bavarian village, had sought meaning in machinery and movement. The war had promised adventure, but delivered only ashes. When Potter, the villainous banker, appeared on screen, a palpable tension filled the room. Here was a character they could understand, the greedy capitalist, the oppressor. But the film treated Potter with complexity, showing how George's decency consistently thwarted his schemes not through violence, but through community and principle. The darkness in the film deepened. Uncle Billy lost the deposit. George faced ruin, his life's work threatened. The Christmas setting, which should have been joyful, turned nightmarish. And then George stood on that bridge, contemplating the unthinkable. Ilsa began to cry quietly. The despair on screen felt too real, too familiar. How many times had she felt that same darkness since her capture? How many nights had she wondered if continuing was worth the pain? Clarence the angel appeared, bumbling and kind, and something shifted in the room. This wasn't going to be a tragedy. The Americans weren't showing them despair without hope, destruction without redemption. "I wish I'd never been born," George declared, and the cosmic machinery of the story granted his wish. What followed was devastating in its simplicity. Bedford Falls transformed into Pottersville, darker, meaner, corrupted by unchecked greed and vice. George wandered through a town where his absence had left a void, where the people he'd helped had suffered without him, where his brother had died because no one was there to save him. The prisoners watched, transfixed, as George slowly comprehended his significance. Every life he'd touched, every kindness he'd shown, every sacrifice he'd made, they mattered. The invisible threads connecting individual to community became visible, undeniable. Greta felt tears on her cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them away. She was thinking of all the small kindnesses she had witnessed and participated in, even during the war. The nurse who had bandaged her hands after a training accident. The teacher who had encouraged her education when resources were scarce. Her mother, who had sacrificed so much. But she was also thinking of the absences, the kindnesses not shown, the compassion withheld, the humanity denied. What if Germany had watched a film like this 5 years ago? Would it have mattered? Could it have changed anything? The screen showed George racing through Pottersville, desperate now to return to his life, to his problems, to his community. "I want to live again," he shouted at Clarence, and the authenticity of that plea struck every woman in the room with the force of recognition. They, too, wanted to live again. The power of stories. The projector hummed in the darkness as George Bailey found himself back on the bridge, back in his life, back in a world where he existed and mattered. The joy on his face as he ran through Bedford Falls, greeting familiar places and faces, was infectious. In the recreation building, Prisoners who hadn't smiled genuinely in months found their lips curving upward. "Merry Christmas, you wonderful old building and loan," George shouted at the shabby office, and several women laughed. Actual laughter, spontaneous and real. The sound startled them almost as much as it startled the guards. Colonel Mitchell, standing at the side of the room, felt her throat tighten with emotion she hadn't expected. George burst into his home, embracing his children with desperate fervor, kissing his wife, celebrating everything he had previously taken for granted. The transformation was complete, from despair to gratitude, from blindness to sight, from isolation to connection. Charlotte found herself weeping openly now, not bothering to hide it. She remembered her own children, evacuated to the countryside when the bombing of Munich intensified. Were they alive? Did they wonder if their mother still existed? The parallels weren't exact, but the emotional truth was universal. When the bank examiner and the sheriff arrived to arrest George, the prisoners tensed collectively. This was the reality they understood: authority, consequence, punishment. But then Uncle Billy burst in with a basket, and Mary's voice called up the stairs, and the miracle of community began to manifest. The townspeople of Bedford Falls flooded into the Bailey home, each bringing money, each contributing what they could. "I wouldn't have a roof over my head if it wasn't for you, George," said one. "I could have been in jail if you hadn't come along," said another. The litany of saved lives, helped families, and preserved dignity was overwhelming. Greta watched as the pile of money grew on the table, as George's debt was erased not by divine intervention or bureaucratic clemency, but by the voluntary actions of people who loved him. It was such a profoundly American scene. Individualistic yet communal, sentimental yet practical, idealistic yet grounded in concrete action. Remember, no man is a failure who has friends, Clarence's note read, and the simple truth of it struck like a hammer. The film's final moments showed George surrounded by family and community, leading everyone in Auld Lang Syne, as snow fell outside the windows. The camera pulled back, Clarence earned his wings, and the credits began to roll. For a long moment after the screen went dark, silence dominated the recreation building. No one moved. No one spoke. The lights came up slowly, revealing faces wet with tears, eyes reddened but bright, expressions of profound emotion. Colonel Mitchell had witnessed many reactions in her military career, but she had never seen anything quite like this. 60 German prisoners, women who had served a regime built on ruthlessness and racial hatred, were crying over a sentimental American film about small-town kindness and community bonds. Slowly, hesitantly, someone began to clap. It was Charlotte, her hands coming together almost involuntarily. Others joined: Margarethe, Ilsa, even skeptical Frida. The applause built, not thunderous but genuine, sustained. Some women were laughing through their tears. Others simply sat, stunned, processing what they had experienced. Lieutenant O'Brien moved through the rows, offering tissues and quiet words. Many prisoners accepted gratefully, too moved to be embarrassed by their emotions. The guards, too, seemed affected, their professional masks slipping to reveal humanity underneath. Greta stood on shaking legs, her mind racing. The film had done something unexpected. It had shown them a version of human society that felt both fantastical and deeply real. Bedford Falls didn't exist, yet every town could be Bedford Falls. George Bailey was fictional, yet every person could be George Bailey. The ideology she had served, the belief she had accepted, had promised community too. Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. But it had been predicated on exclusion, on defining who belonged by defining who didn't. It had demanded conformity, punished dissent, and ultimately delivered not community, but terror. What she had just witnessed on screen was different. The community of Bedford Falls included the strange, the difficult, the imperfect. Mr. Gower was an alcoholic who almost poisoned children. Uncle Billy was forgetful and ineffectual. Even George himself was flawed, frustrated, sometimes angry, often feeling inadequate. Yet they were all valued, all essential to the fabric of their town. Remarkable, Margaretti said softly, joining Greta as the prisoners began filing out. I didn't expect to feel so much. None of us did, Greta replied. As they walked back across the compound under the vast Iowa sky, conversations erupted around them. Women who rarely spoke were sharing reactions, debating meanings, expressing emotions long suppressed. The angel was absurd, Frida insisted, but her voice lacked its usual harsh edge. Completely unrealistic. That's not the point, Charlotte countered. It's about perspective, about seeing your life from outside yourself. We all need that sometimes. Ilsa walked close to Greta, her young face thoughtful. Do you think we could have a Bedford Falls? In Germany, I mean, after all this? It was an impossible question, yet Greta found herself considering it seriously. I don't know. We've broken so much, done so much harm. The world George saved was innocent. Ours isn't. But he thought he'd failed, Ilsa pressed. He thought his life didn't matter, until he saw it from a different angle. They reached Barracks 7 and filed inside. The usual evening routine felt different now, charged with an energy that hadn't existed before. Women prepared for bed while continuing to discuss the film, analyzing scenes, debating meanings, sharing personal connections. Margaretti, lying in her bunk, spoke to the room at large. I kept thinking about all the patients I treated. The soldiers, the civilians, the children. Did I make a difference? I followed orders, worked within the system. But did any of it matter? You save lives, someone offered. Did I? Or did I just prolong suffering? Send boys back to the front to die somewhere else? The nurse's voice was raw with doubt. Charlotte sat up. That's George's question too. Did anything I did matter? And the answer the film gives is yes. Every kindness matters. Every connection matters. Even when we can't see the full picture. But we weren't just working within the system, Frida said quietly, her skepticism finally breaking. We were the system. We were the uniforms. We served the regime. George Bailey never had to reckon with that. The statement hung in the air, undeniable and painful. They weren't George Bailey. They were the townspeople of Pottersville, or worse. They were the architects of Pottersville, the ones who had allowed darkness to flourish. Greta found her voice. Then maybe that's what we take from this. George ought to see what would happen without him. We get to see what happened with us, with our complicity, and now we have to decide what we do next. What can we do? Ilsa asked, her voice small. We're prisoners. The war is over. Germany is destroyed. We can refuse to forget, Margaretti said firmly. We can face what was done, and we can choose, when we finally go home, to be like the people of Bedford Falls, to rebuild with kindness instead of hatred. It sounded naive, almost absurdly optimistic. Yet in that moment, in that barracks filled with women who had just experienced something unexpected, it also sounded possible. As lights went out and the women settled into sleep, Greta lay awake, thinking. Tomorrow, they would return to work details and routine. Tomorrow, the weight of their imprisonment and their nation's defeat would reassert itself. But tonight, something had shifted. Tonight, they had been reminded of something fundamental, that stories mattered, that hope was possible, that every life had value, even theirs. Aftermath and reflection. Morning came too quickly, sunlight streaming through the barracks windows with indifferent brightness. But unlike most mornings, which brought groans and reluctant rising, the women of Barracks 7 woke with something different in their eyes, a thoughtfulness, a lingering connection to the previous evening's experience. Greta noticed it immediately as she performed her own morning routine. Conversations began not with complaints about sleep quality or anxiety about letters from home, but with continued discussion of the film. I dreamed about it, Ilsa confessed during breakfast, stirring her porridge absently. Not the whole film, just that scene where George realizes his life matters. I kept trying to see my own life that way, to understand what I've touched, but it's all confused. Blurred. Charlotte nodded, understanding. Memory is unreliable now. We've been told so many things, believed so many lies. How do we know what was real? The question resonated through the mess hall. Other women from different barracks were having similar conversations, processing the film through their own experiences and traumas. The American guards observed with interest, reporting back to Colonel Mitchell that the experiment had clearly provoked something significant. Later that morning, Greta was again summoned to the colonel's office. She walked across the compound with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What now? Had the film been a test of some kind? Colonel Mitchell stood looking out her window when Greta entered. Without turning, she spoke. I've been reading the reports from last night. 23 separate instances of women crying. Sustained applause. Continued discussions lasting past midnight in several barracks. She turned to face Greta. Tell me what happened in there. Greta chose her words carefully. We saw something we had forgotten could exist. Kindness without propaganda. Community without coercion. Hope without lies. She paused. It reminded us that we're still human, even after everything. Mitchell nodded slowly. That was the intention, but I wasn't certain it would work. You've all been through so much, believed in a system that dehumanized others. I wondered if you could still recognize humanity when you saw it. Some of us never stopped recognizing it, Greta replied quietly. We just learned to look away. That's different for not seeing. The colonel's expression softened slightly. I'm implementing a new program. Weekly film screenings. Different movies, comedies, dramas, musicals. I want you to serve as a liaison to help me gauge which films might have the most impact. Greta felt surprise ripple through her. You're asking me to help with this? You're educated, observant, and the women trust you. Yes, I'm asking. Mitchell pulled out a folder containing film summaries. I'm considering The Grapes of Wrath, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, maybe some Capra documentaries. Your input would be valuable. As Greta reviewed the summaries, she felt the weight of unexpected responsibility. This wasn't just entertainment. This was education, rehabilitation, a careful attempt to reshape perspectives without obvious propaganda. It was manipulation, but manipulation toward empathy rather than hatred. Why cinema? Greta asked. Why not lectures or books? Mitchell smiled slightly. Because stories bypass intellectual defenses. You can argue against a lecture. You can close a book. But a good film? It gets inside before you realize it's happening. Last night proved that. The rest of the morning, Greta worked her assigned detail in the laundry facility, but her mind churned with the implications of this new role. Around her, women scrubbed and sorted while discussing the film, their hands busy but their thoughts elsewhere. Frida, working at the adjacent tub, spoke without her usual cynicism. I kept thinking about Potter, the villain. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who chose money over people, again and again, until it warped him completely. Like many men in Germany, Margarethi added from across the room. She was mending a torn sheet with neat, practiced stitches. Men who made small compromises, then larger ones, until suddenly they were doing unspeakable things and calling it duty. We did that too, someone else said, a woman named Helga who rarely spoke. We made compromises, looked away, convinced ourselves we were just following orders, just surviving. The conversation was veering into dangerous territory, acknowledgement of collective guilt, acceptance of complicity. Yet no one shut it down. The film had opened something, created space for honesty that hadn't existed before. Charlotte, ever the artist, tried to articulate what was happening. The film gave us permission to feel again, to feel deeply without shame. We've been so numb, so hardened. Last night, we remembered how to be moved by simple human goodness. That afternoon, during the recreation period, Greta noticed small changes in behavior. Women who usually remained isolated were sitting in groups, talking. Laughter, still tentative but genuine, occasionally punctuated conversations. Even the American guards seemed to relax slightly, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Young Ilsa approached Greta hesitantly. I wrote a letter to my mother last night. I haven't been able to write before. I didn't know what to say. But after the film, words came. I told her about George Bailey, about Bedford Falls, about hope. She looked embarrassed. It probably sounds foolish. It sounds human, Greta assured her. That's not foolish at all. As evening approached, Greta returned to Colonel Mitchell's office with her thoughts on the proposed films. She had made notes, considering not just content, but timing, emotional readiness, potential triggers. The grapes of wrath might be too heavy too soon, she suggested. They'll see parallels to their own displacement, their own losses. It could help eventually, but maybe we need something lighter first, to build trust in the process. Mitchell listened carefully, occasionally nodding. What would you suggest? A comedy. Something that reminds them laughter is allowed. His Girl Friday, perhaps, or one of the Lubitsch films if you have them. Show them that American cinema isn't all moral lessons. It's also joy, cleverness, playfulness. The Colonel looked surprised. You know American cinema well. Before the war, I watched everything I could. Hollywood was forbidden eventually, but before that, I saw Lubitsch, Hawks, Capra, Sturges. I love the speed, the intelligence, the way your films trusted audiences to keep up. Greta smiled sadly. German cinema became so heavy, so propagandistic. I missed the lightness. They discussed options for an hour, Greta's perspective proving invaluable. She understood both American film grammar and German sensibilities, could predict what would resonate and what might alienate. By the time she left, they had outlined a tentative schedule. Comedy next week, then a musical building toward more serious fare over time. Back at the barracks, the evening routine proceeded with that same new quality of engagement. Women prepared for bed while discussing not just the film, but their lives before the war, their hopes for afterward, their fears and dreams. Do you think Bedford Falls really exists? Ilsa asked the room. I mean, is America really like that? Margaretti laughed, but not unkindly. No place is like that, child. It's an ideal, not a documentary. But ideals matter. They show us what to aim for. Germany had ideals too, Frida pointed out darkly. Look where that led. Different ideals, Charlotte countered. Bedford Falls's ideal is inclusion and mutual support. Germany's ideal was. She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. Purity, Greta finished quietly. Strength, dominance. Our ideals were about who to exclude, not who to embrace. That's the difference. The conversation continued as lights dimmed, voices growing softer but not stopping. Somewhere in the darkness, someone began humming Auld Lang Syne, the melody from the film's final scene. Others joined until the entire barracks was quietly singing, the Scottish folk song carrying meanings it had never held before. Should old acquaintance be forgot? In this barracks, in this moment, nothing was forgotten, but perhaps some things could be forgiven or at least understood differently. The war wasn't over in their hearts, but something new had begun. A process of reconstruction, not of buildings or infrastructure, but of souls. As sleep finally claimed them, the women of Barracks 7 carried with them the image of George Bailey standing in his shabby living room, surrounded by love, saved by community, redeemed by connection. It was just a movie. It was just a story. But sometimes stories were enough to start change. Sometimes they were all you needed to remember that redemption was possible, that humanity persisted, that even in the darkest night, someone somewhere was earning their wings. Tomorrow would bring more work, more questions, more uncertainty. But tonight, they had watched their first American movie, and it had changed them. The ripple spread. The film screening became the fault line along which the camp divided into factions, though divide suggested a violence that wasn't quite accurate. It was more a revelation of existing fault lines, perspectives that had been dormant now activated by shared experience. In the days following It's a Wonderful Life, the recreation building became an unofficial gathering space during free time. Women congregated there even when no film was scheduled, sitting in small groups, discussing not just cinema, but everything the film had touched, questions of meaning, purpose, guilt, and redemption. Greta found herself at the center of many of these conversations, not by design, but by the same gravitational force that had made her an informal leader. She had the education to articulate complex ideas, the temperament to mediate disagreements, and increasingly, the trust of both prisoners and guards. One afternoon, about 3 days after the screening, a heated debate erupted in the recreation building. Frida, despite her emotional reaction to the film, had returned to her defensive skepticism. "It's manipulation," she insisted, her voice carrying across the room. "They show us this sentimental fantasy to make us compliant, to break down our resistance. It's clever propaganda, more sophisticated than what we produced, but propaganda nonetheless." "What exactly are they trying to make us resist?" Charlotte challenged. She had been emboldened by the film, more willing to engage in confrontation. "We've already surrendered. The war is over. What's left to resist? Our identity," Frida shot back. "Our understanding of ourselves. They want us to reject everything we were, everything we believed. To see Germany only as evil and America as righteous." Margarethe, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. "And if Germany was evil? If what we served led to horrors we're only beginning to understand? Should we cling to that identity simply because it's ours?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Other conversations in the room died away as women turned to listen. "I'm not saying we should deny atrocities," Frida said, though her voice had lost some of its certainty. "But neither should we accept that everything about us is unredeemable. That film showed us a world we can never be part of. It reminded us we're outsiders, defeated, judged." Or, Greta interjected quietly, "It showed us what's possible when community is built on inclusion rather than exclusion. When kindness isn't conditional on racial purity or ideological conformity." Young Ilsa, who had been sketching in a notebook, a talent recently revealed, held up her drawing. It showed the recreation building from the previous night, rows of faces lit by the screen's glow, tears visible even in her simple pencil lines. "I drew this from memory," she said. "Do you know what I see? Women who haven't cried in months, letting themselves feel. Women who've been taught to be hard, allowing themselves to be soft. That's not manipulation. That's liberation." Her words, coming from someone so young, carried unexpected weight. Several women nodded agreement. Others looked uncomfortable, as if liberation wasn't something they were ready to embrace. Lieutenant O'Brien entered with an announcement. The next film screening would be in 4 days. The title, The Philadelphia Story, a romantic comedy from 1940. The reaction was mixed. Some welcomed the lighter fare. Others dismissed it as trivial. Colonel Mitchell accompanied O'Brien, which immediately commanded attention. "I know some of you are questioning my motives," she said through O'Brien's translation. "You think this is psychological warfare, another form of control. Perhaps in some ways it is. But consider, your previous government controlled what you watched, read, heard, thought. They did this to make you serve their aims: conquest, hatred, genocide." The last word landed like a physical blow. Several women flinched. Mitchell continued, "I'm showing you films to make you question everything you were told, to think critically, to recognize humanity in unexpected places. If that's control, it's control that returns agency rather than removing it. You're free to hate these films. You're free to reject every message they contain. That freedom is the point." After Mitchell left, the debate continued, but with less heat. Frida remained skeptical, but even she admitted, at least she's honest about it being a form of control. That's more than our leaders ever gave us. Over the following days, Greta observed changes rippling through the camp. Some were subtle, women taking more care with their appearance, not for the guards but for themselves. Others were more obvious, increased letter writing, more engagement in educational classes offered by the camp, even occasional laughter during work details. But there was also resistance. A group of older women, mostly former officials' wives and committed party members, withdrew into increasingly rigid insularity. They viewed the films as corruption, the emotional responses as weakness. They met separately, speaking only German, reinforcing their conviction that they represented true German values against American decadence. Greta watched this parallel development with concern. She mentioned it during one of her now regular meetings with Colonel Mitchell. There's a group, maybe 8 or 9 women, who are actively resisting the program. They're trying to organize others, create a counter-narrative. They call women who enjoyed the film collaborators. Mitchell frowned. Should I be concerned about violence? No, nothing like that. But they're creating division, undermining the progress you're trying to achieve. The colonel considered this. Every society has people who resist change, who cling to the old ways no matter how destructive. We can't force transformation. That would make us no better than the regime you served. We can only offer alternatives and hope people choose growth over stagnation. That evening, the resistant group confronted Greta directly. Their leader, Frau Weber, a woman in her 50s who had been married to a Gestapo officer, cornered her near the barracks. "You're betraying your country," Weber hissed. "Collaborating with the enemy, helping them corrupt German women with their degenerate culture." Greta felt old anger rise, but she kept her voice level. "The country I served no longer exists. The regime we supported committed crimes that history will judge harshly. If learning to see humanity in our former enemies is betrayal, then I gladly betray." "You always were weak," Weber spat. "An intellectual, corrupted by foreign ideas even before the war. Women like you are why Germany fell. You lack proper conviction." Before Greta could respond, Margaretti stepped between them. The nurse, usually so gentle, showed steel in her voice. "No, Germany fell because of people like you. People so convinced of their own righteousness that they couldn't see the evil they were enabling. If conviction means cruelty, I choose weakness every time." Weber retreated, muttering about lost causes and corrupted souls. But as she left, Greta saw something in her eyes, not just anger, but fear. Fear that perhaps she was wrong, that perhaps the ground had shifted beneath her feet, that perhaps everything she had built her identity upon was crumbling. That night, lying in her bunk, Greta reflected on the week. One film, a single sentimental Hollywood movie, and it had become a catalyst, forcing questions that had been suppressed, creating divisions that revealed existing fault lines, offering a mirror in which they could see themselves differently. She thought about George Bailey standing on that bridge, believing his life had been worthless. She thought about how wrong he had been, how much he had mattered to so many people. And she wondered, perhaps naively, perhaps hopefully, if the same might be true for any of them. Not that they had lived good lives. Many had participated in or enabled terrible things. But that perhaps, going forward, they might matter differently. They might build instead of destroy, include instead of exclude, choose connection over purity. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. The resistant group wouldn't simply disappear. The weight of their collective past wouldn't be erased by feel-good cinema. But something had started, fragile, uncertain, but undeniably real. In the darkness of Barrack 7, someone began humming again. Not Auld Lang Syne this time, but something from their childhoods, before the war, before the party, before everything went wrong. Others joined, creating harmony, voices blending despite different tones and capabilities. They were still prisoners, still defeated, still haunted by what they had been part of. But in this moment, they were also human, fallible, seeking, capable of change. The film hadn't absolved them. It hadn't erased anything. But it had reminded them that transformation, however difficult, remained possible. And sometimes that reminder was enough. Comedy and complexity. The second screening approached with different energy than the first, where It's a Wonderful Life had been met with suspicion and uncertainty. The Philadelphia story generated curiosity and even anticipation among many prisoners. But the resistance group, led by Frau Weber, actively campaigned against attendance. "It's a decadent romance," Weber proclaimed in the mess hall. "Frivolous garbage meant to corrupt our moral character. True German women should refuse to participate in this debasement." Her rhetoric found limited traction. Most women were too intrigued by the prospect of laughter, of lightness, of something that wasn't heavy with moral lessons or wartime trauma. Even some of Weber's initial sympathizers quietly indicated they would attend. The evening of the screening, Greta noted that nearly all prisoners showed up. Only Weber and her innermost circle of 3 other women abstained. Their absence was noted but not mourned. The recreation building filled with a different atmosphere than the previous week. Not somber anticipation, but something closer to excitement. Colonel Mitchell made brief opening remarks. Tonight is about joy. Pure, uncomplicated entertainment. Katharine Hepburn, Cary Grant, and James Stewart in a comedy about high society, second chances, and choosing the right life partner. Let yourselves laugh. That's an order. The last phrase, delivered with a slight smile, drew tentative chuckles. Then the lights dimmed, and Tracy Lord's world appeared on screen. From the opening moments, the silent sequence of Tracy's marriage ending, told entirely through physical comedy and expression. The tone was entirely different. This wasn't sentimental. It was sophisticated, quick-witted, playful. The dialogue crackled with intelligence and subtle innuendo. The prisoners, even those with limited English, found themselves drawn into the world of the wealthy Lord family, their privileged problems, their complicated relationships. But instead of resentment at the display of wealth, many felt something unexpected, delight in the clever banter, appreciation for the performances, pleasure in the sheer craftsmanship of the storytelling. Charlotte, the former opera singer, was transfixed by Katharine Hepburn's performance. Here was a woman who was simultaneously strong and vulnerable, intelligent and confused, commanding and uncertain. Tracy Lord made mistakes, said cutting things, hurt people she loved, but remained sympathetic, even admirable. When Cary Grant C.K. Dexter Haven first appeared, several women gasped slightly. His charm was undeniable, his delivery impeccable. The complicated relationship between Tracy and Dexter, divorced but clearly still in love, at odds yet intimately connected, resonated in ways they hadn't expected. Ilsa found herself captivated by the character of Mike Connor, the working-class reporter uncomfortable in high society. His fish-out-of-water quality, his intellectual pretensions, masking insecurity, felt oddly relatable. When he delivered the line about Tracy putting him on a pedestal, about how he was just an ordinary person, several women nodded recognition. The film's comedy was sophisticated, rapid-fire dialogue, social satire, physical humor executed with perfect timing. Unlike German comedy of recent years, which have been broad and often cruel, this was gentle even in its mockery. The rich were sent up, yes, but with affection rather than contempt. Frida surprised herself by laughing repeatedly. The scene where Tracy accidentally breaks the model ship, then tries to hide it, absurd, simple, perfectly executed, struck her as hilarious. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed laughter, how healing even silly humor could be. Margaretti appreciated the film's treatment of marriage and divorce. In Germany, divorce carried tremendous stigma, particularly for women. But here was Tracy Lord, divorced, about to remarry, yet the film treated her with dignity and complexity rather than judgment. The message seemed to be that people made mistakes, relationships failed, and life offered second chances. The swimming pool scene, Tracy drunk, Mike smitten, the potential for scandal, should have been shocking. In many ways, it was showing behavior that German moral standards would condemn. Yet the film handled it with such lightness, such humor, that judgment felt impossible. These were flawed people navigating complicated situations, and their flaws made them human rather than despicable. As the film reached its climax, Tracy's wedding day, her confusion about which man to marry, the revelation that nothing scandalous actually happened the night before, the prisoners found themselves genuinely invested in the outcome. Would she marry the boring but stable George? Return to the charming but complicated Dexter? Run away with the poetic Mike? When Tracy finally chose Dexter, several women sighed with satisfaction. It felt right, not the safe choice or the obvious one, but the authentic one. Two people who knew each other's flaws, who had hurt each other, choosing to try again with honesty instead of illusion. The film's final lines, "I'll be your, I'll get you a new model ship," seemed to encapsulate something essential. Relationships required compromise, forgiveness, shared language, and the willingness to start fresh while acknowledging the past. As the credits rolled and lights came up, the room exploded with conversation, analysis, debate, laughter, exclamations of favorite moments. The mood was entirely different from the first screening, where It's a Wonderful Life had left them moved and contemplative. The Philadelphia story, left them energized and engaged. Charlotte stood and declared to anyone listening, "I forgot cinema could be like this. Intelligent and entertaining, moral without being moralistic, sophisticated without being cold. This is what art should do, elevate while entertaining." Even Frida admitted, "It was well crafted. I'll give them that." The Americans understand how to make a film that respects its audience's intelligence. Young Ilsa turned to Greta with shining eyes. There were so many quotable lines. "The prettiest sight in this fine, pretty world is the privileged class enjoying its privileges. It's subversive, but playfully so, not angry or destructive." As they filed out of the recreation building, Greta observed the guards smiling at each other, pleased with the reaction. Colonel Mitchell caught her eye and nodded approval. The experiment was working. Not just one film, but a program, a series of experiences that gradually opened perspectives and modeled alternatives. Back at the barracks, the women continued dissecting the film. They debated whether Tracy made the right choice. They discussed the class dynamics, Mike Connor's working-class resentment versus the Lord's privileged world. They talked about the portrayal of women, Tracy's strength and vulnerability, Liz's loyalty and wisdom, even the sympathetic treatment of Tracy's mother. "What struck me," Margaretti said, "was how the film showed that everyone was struggling. The rich had their problems too, not as severe as poverty, certainly, but real nonetheless. It was humanizing rather than divisive." German cinema would have made the rich entirely villainous, Charlotte observed, or entirely heroic and noble. Americans seem comfortable with complexity, with showing all sides as mixed. "Maybe that's why they won," Ilsa said quietly, "because they could hold contradictory truths simultaneously. Strong but humble, wealthy but generous, powerful but self-critical." Greta lay in her bunk that night, her mind replaying favorite moments. The sophistication of the writing, the chemistry between the actors, the way humor could carry deeper truths about human nature without heavy-handed moralizing. She thought about Tracy Lord's journey, from rigid perfectionism to accepting human flaws, including her own. There was something in that arc that felt relevant to their situation. They had been taught to pursue purity, perfection, superiority, to divide the world into us and them, superior and inferior, pure and corrupt. But real life, as the film showed, was messy. People were contradictory. Situations were complex. Moral certainty often masked ignorance rather than revealing truth. The ability to laugh at oneself, to accept imperfection, to choose connection over perfection. These weren't weaknesses. They were wisdom. Outside the barracks, two of Weber's resistance group could be seen through the window, talking quietly but with animated gestures. Greta wondered if they were discussing the film, whether they had perhaps watched from the windows, whether resistance was beginning to crack even among the most committed. Change rarely happened through dramatic conversion. More often, it was erosion, small moments of doubt accumulating until certainty crumbled. A laugh at a clever joke, a recognition of humanity in unexpected places, a moment of identification with a character from a former enemy's culture. As sleep approached, Greta heard Ilsa whisper from her bunk, "Do you think we'll watch more films like this?" "I hope so," Greta replied. "Me too. They remind me that the world is bigger than our pain, that there's still beauty and laughter and cleverness, that maybe there's a future worth having." In the darkness, several voices murmured agreement. Tomorrow would bring the familiar routines of camp life. But tonight, they had laughed at an American comedy about wealthy people with complicated love lives. And somehow, that laughter had mattered. It had opened something, created space for hope, modeled a different way of being in the world. Two films, two different approaches to storytelling, two separate but complementary lessons about humanity, connection, and possibility. The program was working. Transformation and understanding. 6 weeks after that first screening of It's a Wonderful Life, the film program had become central to life at Fort Des Moines. 7 films total had been shown. Comedies, dramas, musicals, each provoking discussion, debate, and gradual transformation in the prisoners' worldviews. Greta sat in Colonel Mitchell's office reviewing the next month's elections. The relationship between captor and prisoner had evolved into something closer to collaboration, though neither would use that word exactly. Mutual respect, perhaps. Shared purpose. "I'm considering the grapes of wrath for next week," Mitchell said, sliding a synopsis across the desk. "It's time for something more challenging." "They're ready now." Greta read the summary. Oklahoma farmers displaced by the Dust Bowl, their desperate migration to California, the indignity of poverty and prejudice they faced. She nodded slowly. Yes, they'll see themselves in this. Displaced people, uncertain futures, loss of everything familiar. But you should prepare them first. Make it clear this is about American suffering, not just German. To show them Americans can be self-critical. Exactly. We were taught that only Germany engaged in honest self-examination, that other nations were hypocritical. Showing them an American film that criticizes American society, that will matter. Mitchell made notes. The women have changed remarkably. Even I didn't expect this level of transformation. Greta considered this. Change was evident. In posture, in conversations, in the gradual breakdown of the rigid hierarchies that had characterized the camp's early months. But she was careful not to overstate it. Not all have changed. Weber and her group remain resistant. And even those of us who have been moved by these films, we carry our past. Cinema can open minds, but it can't erase complicity. "I'm not trying to erase anything," Mitchell said firmly. "I'm trying to help you rebuild on honest foundations. To recognize what you were part of so you can choose to be part of something different going forward." That evening's film was Meet Me in St. Louis, a Technicolor musical about family, home, and change. It was perhaps the lightest selection yet. Nostalgic, sentimental, beautiful. The prisoners settled in with the comfortable anticipation of people who had learned to trust the experience. Watching Judy Garland sing the trolley song, seeing the lush colors and elaborate sets, many women felt transported. This was America before the war, before Pearl Harbor, before everything became militarized and serious. This was innocence, perhaps naive, but real nonetheless. When young Tootie sang, "Have yourself a merry little Christmas," to comfort her heartbroken sister, tears flowed freely throughout the recreation building. The song spoke of troubles being far away, of hanging shining stars upon the highest boughs. In this camp, in these circumstances, such hopes seemed simultaneously impossible and essential. Charlotte was particularly moved by the film's portrayal of family unity, the way the Smith family ultimately chose to stay together in St. Louis rather than pursue the father's career advancement in New York. The message that people mattered more than ambition, that home was about relationships rather than geography, resonated deeply. After the film, instead of immediately returning to barracks, many prisoners lingered in the recreation building, talking quietly. The guards accustomed to this now allowed it. Ilsa approached Greta with her notebook, now filled with drawings inspired by the films they had watched. "I've been thinking about all of them together, what they're teaching us. And I think they're showing us that being human means being connected. George Bailey needed his town. Tracy Lord needed Dexter to see her truly. The Smith family needed each other. Every film is about connection." Margaretti joined them, and about choosing connection even when it's difficult, even when individual ambition or pride or hurt feelings say to withdraw. Frida, who had gradually softened her resistance over the weeks, added her perspective. The German way was about subordination to the collective, but not genuine connection. We were interchangeable parts in a machine. These films show actual community. Messy, complicated, voluntary. The conversation attracted others, a circle forming naturally. This had become common. Film screenings followed by philosophical discussions that stretched late into the evening, guards tolerating and sometimes even listening to the debates in languages they couldn't understand. "What'll we take back?" someone asked. "When we finally go home, whenever that is, what do we take from all this?" The question hung heavy. Home seemed both impossibly distant and frighteningly close. Letters from Germany described devastation, hunger, chaos. The country they had known no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Charlotte spoke carefully. We take the knowledge that there are different ways to build society. That strength doesn't require cruelty. That community doesn't require exclusion. That art can elevate without lying. We take our guilt too, Margaretti added quietly. We can't leave that behind, but maybe we can transform it into something useful. Motivation to build differently, to refuse to look away when others are suffering. Frau Weber chose that moment to walk past the recreation building, accompanied by her dwindling group of supporters. Through the window, she looked at the assembled prisoners with what appeared to be contempt but might have been envy. To be so certain, so unbending, it must be exhausting, but also perhaps comforting in its simplicity. Later that night, as Barracks 7 prepared for sleep, Greta reflected on the journey they had undertaken. It seemed almost absurd that cinema, Hollywood entertainment, could have such impact, but perhaps that was precisely why it worked. The films weren't lectures or directives. They were stories that invited emotional engagement, that bypassed intellectual defenses, that showed rather than told. It's a Wonderful Life had reminded them that individual lives mattered, that every person touched countless others in ways they couldn't see. The Philadelphia Story had shown them that humor and intelligence could coexist, that people were complex and contradictory, yet still worthy of love. Meet Me in St. Louis had emphasized family and home as choices rather than obligations, connections maintained through devotion rather than duty. And the film still to come would continue the education. The Grapes of Wrath would show American self-criticism and the dignity of suffering people. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington would demonstrate idealism confronting corruption. Casablanca would explore sacrifice and moral complexity in wartime. Each film was a small piece of a larger mosaic, collectively painting a picture of a culture that, while far from perfect, at least aspired to self-reflection, to inclusion, to the belief that people could change and grow and build something better from rubble. Greta, Ilsa's voice came softly from her bunk. Do you think we can really go back to Germany? After all this, after everything we've learned? It was the question many harbored, but few articulated. Could they return to the ruins, carrying these new perspectives? Would they be able to implement change? Or would the weight of collective trauma and the desire for simple answers crush any attempt at nuanced reconstruction? We'll have to, Greta replied honestly. Germany is our home, our responsibility. But we go back different than we left. We go back having seen ourselves from outside, having recognized our complicity, having glimpsed alternatives. That has to count for something. Will anyone listen? Some will, others won't. That's always how change works. Gradually, through accumulation of small shifts rather than sudden revolution. In the darkness, Charlotte began to sing softly. Not a German song, but Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas from the evening's film. Her trained voice gave the melody heartbreaking beauty. Others joined, harmonizing, the English words stumbling but sincere. Someday soon, they all would be together, if the fates allowed. Until then, they would muddle through somehow. The guards, making their rounds, paused outside Barracks 7 to listen. One of them, a young lieutenant from Ohio who had fought through France and Germany, found himself moved by the sound of former enemies singing an American song with such emotion. Words made no sense. People were just people, trying to survive, seeking connection, hoping for mercy. Inside, the singing faded into silence, then into sleep. Tomorrow would bring another work day, another round of routines, another step forward in the slow process of rebuilding shattered selves. But tonight, they had watched their 8th American film. They had laughed and cried, discussed and debated, seen themselves reflected in stories from a foreign culture. They had been reminded that transformation was possible, that understanding could bridge seemingly impossible divides, that even in the aftermath of the worst war in human history, hope persisted. 60 German women prisoners of war had learned to love American cinema. But more importantly, they had learned to see themselves as part of a larger human family. Flawed, complicated, capable of terrible things, but also capable of change, growth, and redemption. The films couldn't erase their past. Nothing could. But they had opened a door to a different future, one where former enemies might become, if not friends, at least fellow travelers in the difficult work of building peace from the wreckage of war. And sometimes, in the darkness of a POW camp in Iowa, in the summer of 1945, that possibility was enough. It had to be.